the Russians were happy for this peace plan to be leaked, and it does seem that Kirill Dmitriev, if you like, the sort of commercial negotiator, he's Witkoff's counterpart, that he was the one who leaked the draft, that they did this, in fact, to try to whip up anxiety in Ukraine and an expectation that the Ukrainians were about to be sold down the river by the US.
At this stage, what's your hunch about what's going to happen next week with this visit to Moscow?
I suspect that Witkoff will come back with his understanding of what Putin has said. We'll relay that to Trump, and it'll probably be about 60% correct. We have a good indication that he understood something very different from what Putin had said when they met before the Anchorage summit. And that's one reason why Anchorage took place, because he felt the Russians were showing flexibility and were ready to compromise. And that wasn't the case at all. So, here's a man who goes into a meeting without his own interpreter, without anybody from the US embassy, and goodness knows how he takes notes, where he's just relying on his memory. So, there is a big problem there to begin with. Is he going to understand the message that he's given? But I think what's different this time, perhaps, is that Trump seems to be in an absolutely massive hurry and just determined to get this agreement done. So what is his reaction going to be when Witkoff comes back and says that the Russians are not in agreement with what I took over, and we need to address the following points? And they'll be the very difficult ones. They'll be around the issue of territory, the recognition of those territories if they're occupied by Russia, security guarantees for Ukraine. Again, extraordinarily vague what the US has in mind here. And last but not least, related to that, the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. So it's possible it will all fall apart. But equally, it's possible that Trump will say, "Look, I've just had enough of this," and the Ukrainians are the ones standing in the way of a peace deal, backed by the Europeans. So I'm just going to steamroller them and tell them this is a deal, take it or leave it. Otherwise, I'll just go and do my own deal with the Russians, which is also a possibility.
You say Donald Trump appears to be in a mad rush about this, but at the same time, he had given the deadline of Thanksgiving to actually for Ukraine to agree, or else he was threatening to cut off US intelligence and weapons supply. But we are talking today on Thanksgiving, and that has not happened yet. So perhaps there is some room for a little bit more patience, and perhaps there is a slight window there of opportunity.
I like to think so. And I have to say, I was one of those who felt that after the failure of the Anchorage summit, it seemed that Trump was pivoting another way. Finally, he imposed sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, major Russian oil exporters, which seemed to have certainly freaked out the Indians, who've been taking a lot of oil from Russia because they feared secondary sanctions. To a much lesser extent, of course, China. I don't think the Chinese were particularly concerned about what Trump was threatening, because they seem to think they can probably manage him. But suddenly, we came back to another frantic effort to achieve a peace deal. So this was going on all in the background at the same time as Trump was seemingly pivoting away from talks with Russia. So it's quite possible, you may be right, that we get into another cycle where the really difficult issues can't be resolved in this draft peace plan. And Trump tells Marco Rubio, well, you've got to go and sort it out, and let's see if we can have another go. And it takes another, let's say, 6 to 8 weeks, during which time it's possible that Ukraine's situation on the battlefield, I suspect, will not improve, and it could indeed worsen. The Russians will be creating the impression in Trump's mind that they're on the verge of the big breakthrough. They've been saying this for many months now. Possible that Putin has also persuaded Trump that the Ukrainians are going to collapse any moment, which, by the way, I don't believe. But there is a school of thought that the Russians were happy for this peace plan to be leaked, and it does seem that Kirill Dmitriev, if you like, the sort of commercial negotiator. He's Witkoff's counterpart, that he was the one who leaked the draft, that they did this, in fact, to try to whip up anxiety in Ukraine and an expectation that the Ukrainians were about to be sold down the river by the US. And I mean, that hasn't, of course, had so far the desired effect. It has made people, of course, extremely anxious, and not just in Kiev, because in European capital as well, nerves are jangling because it's just not clear what the Americans are expecting to get out of this, and whether sort of struggle within the administration might end up with, let's say, I would describe them, the sort of more realistic people like Marco Rubio will be able to restore some balance and say, look, we're actually going to damage long-term US national security interests if we simply abandon Ukraine and force Ukraine into an unequal deal. So there may still be some space, but I think we also have to accept the fact that President Trump at some point needs to get back to domestic issues in the US. Those election results in New York and Virginia showed that we can see that in the opinion polls, he's not doing so well. And there are people in the MAGA movement who's saying to him, why are you spending so much time on foreign affairs? So he may have a limited room for maneuver here. But I do think it's also worth considering for a moment the sort of Putin side of the equation, because it's just easy to think that he can carry on for another 6 months and just roll over the Ukrainians. Well, I'm sure he thinks that, and he would like to do that. But there is also, I think, in Russia, some increasing questioning about the purpose of this war, what it's ultimately going to yield, and the idea, let's say, that the Russians get the whole of Donbass. What on earth are they going to do with it? This territory that had been significantly depopulated, the Russians have destroyed much of it. This is what they call in Russian, as a nice phrase, it's a suitcase without a handle. This is an enormous burden for them.
Because there's also the school of thought that the leaking of this document, this 28-point plan, was also perhaps an attempt to see if the Donbass could be ceded to Russia without them having to fight for it, because the price to fight for it, well, it would just take too long, and it would be impossible for it to do it with any expediency.
Well, possibly. Of course, so it's much more convenient if you can use diplomacy as a means to achieve your goals rather than to have to fight. I mean, let's face it. I think Putin and those around him are absolutely indifferent to the loss of human life, and the fact that there may be upwards of 250,000 Russian soldiers killed in this war so far, up to anything like 800,000 to 1 million people severely injured. I don't think they care about that at all. But there is still the economic pressure. But I think in more broadly, both within the elites and in society, the questioning about why are we doing this? What are we getting out of it? How does this actually help us? And is it really ever going to redound to Russia's credit that we entered into this war? And simply by force of arms took away territory from a neighboring country which we considered previously to be very friendly towards us. So there are huge questions there, and quite apart from the fact that the relationship with Europe, let's say at the very least, has been so severely damaged, and that's of course reflected in the fact that Russia's not supplying any pipeline gas to Europe as it did for 50 years. The fact that Russia is now much more dependent on China than it was before the start of the war. Russia would not be fighting this war if it were not for Chinese support and the readiness of China, to buy Russian crude oil, to supply it with very important dual-use goods that have kept industry functioning at a certain level. So there are, of course, many, many questions about this. So I don't think we should underestimate the fact that Putin may find himself in a bit of a quandary here, or just nervous about how long it will take, in fact, to let's say, conquer more of Donbass or to force Ukraine into a surrender, because everything so far suggests this all takes much longer than the Russians would ever have believed. The fact that we're fast approaching what would be in February the fourth anniversary of this war, into a fifth year of this war, that many observers, both in Russia and indeed outside, thought would be accomplished in, if not a matter of days. I don't think anybody seriously believed that, but by a matter of weeks.
Well, they thought it was a coup at first, didn't they?
Well, indeed, this idea that the invading Russian army took with it, parade uniforms to celebrate the victory, with some sort of march past on the main street of Kiev. So even if Ukraine is suffering on multiple fronts at the moment, I suspect that the level of resistance, if they have adequate support from the European partners at least, could lead to this war continuing for a good long period, and much longer than the Kremlin might expect.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.